Just welcome Stewart Rhodes to come share with us this morning.
Okay, folks, let's get started. This will be kind of a schizophrenic talk. We'll talk a little bit about politics and nullification. But I'm going to, first of all, I want to say a few things about training. Just to add to what Matt said last night, I unfortunately didn't catch his speech because I had a migraine. I took off to my truck and woke up when the fireworks were going off. But I heard he was out laying down some goals. One thing I'd like to advocate is that you focus on your personal skills. And as we were just talking about a minute ago, the founders had an idea of a balanced person, which goes back to the Greeks. The Athenians were proud of the fact that they could be both warriors and merchants and craftsmen and lawyers and doctors and whatever else they were. That was their ideal. And the founders kind of picked up on that too. As opposed to like Sparta, where you had professional warriors and then they had their helots, their slaves. They like to see a balanced society of people who were, did all these things. And you look at guys like Jefferson, very much Renaissance men. But the one core thing that everybody was a soldier. And like I said in my speech the other day, what you're really supposed to be is light infantry. That's what a militia is. And so I would encourage all of you to think in terms, like in the Marine Corps. How many here, where's a Marine? The Marines? Every Marine's a rifleman first. That's one of their ethics. And I think that's a good way to look at things. Everyone should be an infantryman first. And like John Mackey, he's now in Idaho, but was on my board of directors from Las Vegas. He was a naval commander. And while he was on the board of Oath Keepers and our treasurer, I happened to ask him if he had a rifle, and he said no. I said, how can you, what are you doing? Just stop everything else you're doing. If you don't have a rifle, then how are you even a citizen? What is that? What are you? Didn't know a rifle, so I gave him an old rifle I had, most of the gun, and 500 rounds of ammo, and said, there, now you got a rifle. You got something. So we get so wrapped up in politics a lot that we kind of forget about those core, vital parts of being an American. And I think it's important for you to start thinking in terms of, do I have light infantry skills? And what are those? Well, it's move, shoot, communicate. You need to be able to move, which means getting in shape, like Matt told you last night. But also means knowing how to move tactically together as a team. Basic patrolling. When I was in the Army, we learned basic patrolling. When I was in reconnaissance unit, got a little more advanced patrolling. Just getting out in the woods and learning how to move and not get lost. Land navigation, learning how to move quietly, and as a team is important. And then when you're in a firefight, then you need to be able to move tactically within that circumstance, moving as a team. Fire teams and squads, things like that. So being able to move, shoot, and that's accuracy with your shooting, and speed too. And the Appleseed program, I recommend. Lady here's been to one. Matt's been to one before right now. Yeah, now Appleseed's a real good program, basic rifle, marksmanship, kind of old school marksmanship, teaching you how to shoot effectively with your rifle. And then you can, go from there to all kinds of private schools out there. Larry Vickers is a good one. Gun sight, front sight, a bunch of these places around the country. If you can get to one of those, or one of the regional instructors, do it. Get yourself skilled up. Guys who've been just back from Iraq and Afghanistan and have pretty good gun handling skills or combat experience, learn from them. Pick their brains. Vietnam vets, go learn from them. But start thinking in terms of, like I said the other day, who's on your fire team or your buddy team? Who's on your buddy team? Who's the other person that if it's a husband and wife, that's a buddy team right there. Father and son. Who's on your buddy team? Who's on your fire team? 4 people. Who's on your squad? A couple of fire teams. Start thinking in those terms. Because if you ever need to defend yourself and your family, you got to work as a team. And if you ever need to defend yourselves as a community, you got to work as teams too. So start thinking like that and train like that. Find out ahead of time what your limitations are. We're not all, some of us are not as good a shape as we used to be, and we need to get in better shape, but know your limitations, know what you can and can't do, and then work within those. And a critical skill I think you all should be thinking along the lines of is sniping. In any context. Divorce it from our current political situation and our concerns. The founders intended for you to all be competent at small unit tactics, And one of the things that made a difference, even in the Revolutionary War and also in other conflicts since then, has been accurate rifle fire. And probably the two most effective people on the battlefield are scout, sniper, and spotter. Very difficult for the enemy to deal with. Tremendous force multipliers. You know, if I were the bad guy coming into an area, whatever I am, whether it's a gang or some invader, the last thing I would ever want to have on my back would be like a Marine scout, sniper, as a spotter. That'd be, you know, they could shut down whole units, force people to button up, force people to stop moving, all that stuff. It's very telling psychological impact on the enemy as well. So if you're looking at a prospect of having to fight for your freedom against whoever in the future, having the ability to put accurate rifle fire at long range from concealment, effective concealment, being able to move quietly and not be seen is really important. You know, two guys can do an awful lot, two people. So anyway, the other day I touched on the veterans organizations, how important they are. And this kind of ties in with today's topic, nullification. I think that we've been so focused on politics that most Americans, they only come together in a purely political association. They come together as part of a, you know, whether it's a Ron Paul meetup group or the official GOP Central Committee for the county, that kind of stuff. They work in campaigns, but otherwise they're atomized and spread out, isolated families. They come together at church sometimes. It's the same kind of problem. Most Americans don't know their neighbors, and so when it comes right down to it, in the middle of the night, if they're attacked or whatever, they don't have a support structure nearby. And because they only focus on politics, it's like they're only coming together and coordinate in a very narrow field of human life. And I talked about that the other day. We need to be full spectrum citizens. And so preparedness is critical. Taking personal responsibility and community responsibility for fire protection, for medical aid. Like, you know, out here, you've only got, what do you got? You got to rely on yourself for medical aid. Same goes for rural Montana, where I live. You are not going to get response within a half an hour, 45 minutes, sometimes an hour if you're lucky, you know, depending upon where you live. So you already know that. Living out in the country, you tend to feel that more personally. When you're driving down the middle of nowhere and you have a car accident, it's going to be on you. So I think it's critical for people to start, you know, coming together and training and working together to develop the support structures you're going to need, whether it's communications, emergency medical, transport, fuel and shelter, things like that. Think about it in community terms, not just individual preppers. But in politics, by only coming together for elections and joining a party, I think Americans have lost their way. Founders were very skeptical of political parties. As George Washington said, the danger is you become loyal to the party first before your country. And I think that's part of the problem is that it's become like sports teams. You know, one side's got their face painted blue, the other side's got their face painted red. And when your team's got the ball, you just cheer, you boo the ref. If someone's pointing out a constitutional violation, you just boo, you know. Who cares about the rule books? Your guys are always right. And then when they got the ball, it's the exact opposite. Everything that they do, you boo and yell and scream at the ref. You got to stop them, ref. And then their side is cheering no matter what they do. And that's kind of how it is politically in this country. When the Republicans are in power, the Democrats rediscover the Constitution. They're running around, you know, like it was in the Bush years, you know, quoting Ben Franklin, quoting all the founding fathers, turning their back on guys like John Hughes, which he deserved, turning their back on these atrocious Bush lawyers that were making the president into a dictator by their legal arguments, justifying torture, justifying the whole thing. And so the Democrats rediscovered the Constitution, and it was Republicans who were just cheering their guy on who do no wrong, especially in the name of fighting war and terrorism. Then now it's the exact opposite now. Then Obama gets elected, and the Democrats forgot about the Constitution, and now their guy can do no wrong. And if you dare to oppose him, you must be racist. You know, that's the mantra. And all they're really doing is just playing cheerleaders, just like the Republicans did. And now the Republicans are the ones rediscovering the Constitution. The only chance this country has of being saved politically is that there is a growing third part of the population that's consistent in defense of liberty. That's consistent about calling out violations of the rule book, the Constitution. And some of those folks, I mean, the Ron Paul movement is a good example of that. You don't need to be a Ron Paul supporter to be in the liberty movement or the freedom movement. Whether you consider yourself a Ron Paul person or a Barry Goldwater conservative or a Chuck Baldwin supporter, you know, Constitution Party person, you're all in the same group.
Jefferson conservative.
Jeffersonian. Yeah, I mean, classical liberal Jeffersonian is what I can call myself. You know, I believe in individual liberty, a limited government for that end. So I'm an anarchist, you know. In that camp could be people who have gone all the way to being anarchists, you know, like anarcho-capitalists. They don't believe in government because they believe that it's a violation of natural rights. You know? Anyway, point being is that there's a growing part of the population that is not loyal to party first, they're loyal to freedom first. And we can have lots of disagreements within it, and we do. But that's one difference. And it really is, the spectrum is not left and right, which is an arbitrary assignment of terms. It's between individual liberty and collectivism. It's between the concept of natural rights and inherent rights and this concept of government being God. Okay, that's really the difference. And the liberty movement is individualist, believe in individual liberty. And I think that most of the people who adhere to party first, they don't really have a conviction like that. And they've either they've never even thought about it, they're just kind of defaulting along with the party leaders. Like in the GOP, for example. The GOP is now, at this time, dominated by neoconservatives. And what are they? Well, originally they came out of the Democratic Party. They were the Scoop Jackson Democrats. They parted with their socialist fellow travelers in that they were national socialists rather than international socialists. And so they wanted a strong U.S. military, and they wanted the Pax Americana, you know, enforced by American military power, not believing in, you know, the international communist ideal. That's where they differ. National socialists, of course, I'm sure they hate this. They call this national socialists versus the international socialists. The Democratic Party is still dominated by international socialists, by Marxists. And of course, they hate being called that too, but that's what they are. What is a progressive? It's a Marxist. So the Democratic Party is dominated by Marxists. The Republican Party at this time is dominated by national socialists, and they are very fascist in many of the ways of their thinking. They do believe in a marriage between big government and big business, corporate power, aligned with government power. They don't believe in a true free market, and they certainly don't believe in individual liberty. So, we're in a lot of trouble. But there's that third part that's growing, and they come from both sides. I've seen plenty of people who used to be Democrats that became Ron Paul supporters, and now they're in Oath Keepers, because the Oath Keepers were kind of an offshoot of the Ron Paul campaign. So I've got guys who used to be Democrats, and I've got guys that used to be Republicans. You know, and they're both in rehab from both of them. So our salvation is possible through growing that third part that's consistent in defense of liberty, that puts liberty first. And I think what we have to do is, rather than we have to take a long-term view when it comes to politics, you got to operate within short-term realities that you might run out of time, that we might have to fight before we can fix it politically. But along the way, I think it's very dangerous to have sincere conservatives or constitutionalists be so afraid of the short-term danger that they compromise their principles. I was talking to a gentleman last night about that. When people vote for Romney because they're so afraid of Obama, and they feel like, well, you know, even Sheriff Mack endorsed Romney because he said, yes, he did. And, you know, and Sheriff Mack's on my board and a good friend of mine. I disagree with him fundamentally on that. But he said, well, you know, Obama's an existential threat to the Republic. If we don't stop him, he's going to destroy the Republic. And that might be true. But I just see Obama as the front man or the current puppet what's been going on for multiple decades. You know, Bush was just as dangerous to the Constitution. In fact, maybe more so, because so many conservatives were asleep at the switch while Bush was in office. And I feel like if Romney had been elected, they'd have gone back to sleep. And he could have continued on and maybe finished the creation of the infrastructure of a totalitarian state under Romney because they'd all been asleep. So frankly, I prefer that Obama won. Because now more conservatives will still pay attention to the Constitution, looking at it in a more long-term view. But the problem with setting aside your principles because you're so afraid of the current situation that you know, I got to vote against Romney, so I'm going to vote against Obama, so I got to vote for Romney. Is what you're doing is you are. It's like the most important thing is you've set aside your principles. And it might be that's the design. Maybe the real goal is by running John McCain's and Romney's and everything else and these two false choices is not so much. I mean, they don't really care which one wins, right? If back to the sports team analysis. If the bad guys own the entire stadium and own both teams, they don't care which one wins. You're still paying your fee. You're still coming in and being a spectator. They still win. And part of playing the game is getting you to compromise your principles. And that might be their goal. To get you to, out of fear, vote for someone you know is an oath breaker, to get you to set aside your principles. So you are now an unprincipled person. You are now an immoral person. You no longer operate under a moral code. It's expediency. And when you do that, you become one of them. That's all they're about is expediency. And saying, well, we have to do this. It's the practical thing to do right now. And nothing's perfect. And politics is all about compromise and blah, blah, blah. And they get you to set aside your principles. How could you ever take up arms and stand up and say, I have a right to rebel at some future point if you help put them in power by compromising your principles? If prior to the American Revolution kicking off, Sam Adams and John Adams and Hancock and Patrick Henry and all the rest had supported loyalists into political office, how could they then oppose, you know, what they did once they were in? How could they then ever say we have a right to rebel? They were principled.
Could you digress just for a minute, Stewart? At this point, it's too bad we don't have a smoke alarm for the liberty movement when someone in our midst suggests doing the same thing just to get us over the next hill. Because I've seen it so many times over the last 30 years in the Republican Party. They're willing to throw everything out the window just to prevent us from electing another, I don't know, fill in the blank, some progressive.
And you know, and some of that is the party at the upper levels. They're not really any different. They know
human nature, though. I think.
But taking advantage of human nature. But you can get people at the lower levels, rank and file, who are very sincere. They don't want to see a socialist in office or an absolute Marxist, and so they'll vote for the watered-down Republican instead. But like I said the other day, this is like taking reduced doses of poison. And it's now at an advanced stage. It's now at such an advanced stage that cancer is metastasized and grown so big and so powerful that the only way you're ever going to stop it, we're not really sure how we're going to have to stop it, but one thing is for sure, you've got to stop compromising. You have to. Because even if you think that a pure political solution is too late, like Claire Wolfe said, you know, a few years back, it's too late to work within the system, but it's too soon to suit the bastards yet. So, you know, it might be that way. But by not compromising, at least you have a clear conscience, and you're absolved of your allegiance to party. You've separated yourself from the concept of compromising your principles and oath breaking, and you become, you know, a true defender of liberty. It might be you still go down in defeat. It might be you still have to fight a bloody conflict.
Actually, I think.
But you'll do so with a clear conscience and some moral authority.
I think Matt's description that compromise is kind of an inadequate word. It actually is a violation of principle.
Yeah, you become a violent.
And compromise is actually is getting to the point where you're willing to accept a little bit less than you were seeking.
Well, I mean, in the eyes, like just take the gun issue, for example. In the eyes of the anti-gunners, compromise means you agree to give up some of your liberty. You take it like a loaf, you give them one slice, then they want another slice, they want another slice, and you want with a crumb at the end, and then you lose that too. That's what they mean by compromise. And that's what the neocons mean too. They're willing to sell liberty down the road. They're willing to sell the Constitution down the road, Bill of Rights, for political power. And they use the con game of, well, you have to vote for us, or those guys even worse. But anyway, the point being is that there is a change happening. There's kind of like a revival of an idea of being principled and not compromising that's coming up. And that third party, that third group is growing. And that's what the powers that be don't know how to handle. How do they handle this growing third part of the population that can't be manipulated? So what do, you know? So I think in some ways, you know, their days are numbered. And I encourage people to not give up on the cities. You know, there is a big difference between the culture and life of the city and the culture and life in the country, for sure. But I think, and don't give up on young people. You know, I think a lot of conservatives have kind of given up on young people and said, well, this current generation doesn't understand freedom. I don't think so. I went down, when I was in Nevada, I was in the Central Committee there in Nevada and worked in the campaign in 2008 and then again in 2012 in Montana. What I saw was the opposite. It was the older people in the GOP who were set in their ways and big government lovers and could not be even talked to about the Constitution. They were party loyalists first. There were the young people coming in, new Ron Paul Republicans, who were on fire for liberty. And they understood it. And I think the reason is the internet. Public school has been a failure. They're so dismal at anything that they haven't even successfully indoctrinated and brainwashed the youth. So they go out of public school, you know, their real education is on the internet. So unless there's some Marxist professor gets a hold of them and indoctrinates them in college, the internet's a wide open field. And so they're open to the message of liberty when they hear it. But anyway, the point being is that Ron Paul has shown, his campaign has shown, that you can grab these young people, even after public school, and wake them up. So don't give up on them. And that's one of the problems with only coming together in association with politics. It tends to be an old crowd. Where, I even asked people this, you know, where are your children and grandchildren? Why aren't they here? Well, even right now. Where are they? Well, mine are in bed. Yours are probably too. But usually, you go to Republican meetings, for example, it's all older people, hardly any young people at all. And so, you know, that's what's nice about this church here, and Chuck Baldwin's church is kind of the same way. You talk freedom from the pulpit. They hear it every Sunday, and you're all together through other activities as a family, as a community. So I think that's why it's important to not just do only politics. That's why what Chuck Baldwin said about the church is necessary, absolutely necessary and essential that the churches start talking about liberty. So, but anyway, kind of rambling. But anyway, the point being is that it can't just be about politics, conventionally understood. So back to the veterans groups. That's why the veterans groups are important too. And they have the same kind of problem the churches do. You go to a veterans group and they say, well, we're chartered by Congress. We have 501c status. And we're concerned about, it can't be political. And so they'll have like these big efforts to put signs on the highway to warn against drunk driving, et cetera. American Legion is doing all kinds of stuff like that, and seatbelt signs and all kinds of drives. Nothing about the Constitution. And they're all oath sworn. What are they doing to defend the Constitution? Keep their oath. So it's important for us to tap into those institutions. What's happened is that the Marxists did a long march through our institutions. They went through and they took over our political institutions, our educational institutions, the law, the lawyers and the judges, and they warped their sense of ethics and morality, like in law. And Matt knows this, other lawyers understand it. Rather than being loyal to the Constitution first as the ethical paramount, It is being a zealous advocate for your client. And what if your client's the U.S. government? Well, that means being a zealous advocate for the U.S. government. So once you're a government lawyer, your job is to defend whatever the government does. I can't remember the last time I saw a government lawyer tell their client, you can't do that, it's unconstitutional. No, their job is to go find an argument and to make it constitutional. And then they can become judges. And what a surprise that the same people who had that kind of ethic of doing whatever it takes to make it constitutional, then do the same when they're a judge, for their party or for their ideology. So, and the veterans are kind of the same way. They don't want to talk about politics. Their only outlet for politics is when they go into the part of a party, the part of the GOP usually. Most of them are conservatives. And then what are they being told there? Well, it's all about making our party win, getting our candidates elected. And so what's their loyalty? Is it to the Constitution first? No. It's to party. Like the government lawyer, they're just as bad as the Democrat operative. What's the difference? So I think it's critical for us in some ways to separate out conventional politics in the minds of our fellow Americans. It's much more difficult to talk to a GOP Central Committee member during a GOP Central Committee meeting about the Constitution. I'd much rather talk to him as a veteran over a beer about his oath responsibilities.
Yeah, there you go.
And about doing things that are outside of conventional politics.
That's good.
And what winds up happening, though, if you go into if you go into a veterans organization and you talk to them about the coming economic collapse and the death of the dollar, which is coming, and you give them a good dose of reality, and start talking to them about preparedness and the need to get their radios and gear together and see each other as a unit again and start training together. Did I say anything about being a Republican? No. You get them to think in terms of the founder's ideal was a disinterested man who was doing what was right for his country. Not party loyalty, not for his own ambitions. Disinterested. He cared about his country first. If you can get them to start thinking in those terms, that's why I recommend doing it through preparedness. The side benefit is that they become now, in some ways, inoculated against this brainwashing or rehabilitated against this idea of party loyalty first. Get them to start thinking outside of that box, thinking in terms of preparedness and community and service to their country like they used to when they were in the military. When you're in the military, because it is kind of apolitical, you're not thinking in terms of left and right, Republican, Democrat. You're thinking about your country. So tap into them. Wake them up to what's going on. And it's going to be somewhat political when you talk about things. That's why it's incredibly important to point out the errors of both sides. You've got to be consistent. If you're consistent, and you don't compromise, you talk about what's going on, and you don't pull any punches, then you can get them to see what's going on and keep their mind wrapped around being an American first. You know, I'm an American first, not a Republican first. So anyway, if you can get them to do that, what you do wind up with is a block of voters who vote for the Constitution first. They join that third party. You know, you can do it through the Ron Paul movement, you can do it through the Constitution Party, but another way to do it, I think, is to go in there with those veterans and reactivate them under their oath. I think it's a strong, underutilized weapon for us. So just as the churches, same thing. From the pulpit, when you're preaching about liberty, you're not loyal to party. No. You strip that away, right? Leave your party at the door. Yeah. So you go to the door, leave your party at the door. Same goes for the Veterans Hall. We have a chance for that same kind of revival among the veterans organizations. We have to get these post commanders convinced to have the courage to do it, to bring us in and let us talk about stuff. And what's kind of happening now is oath keepers have managed to put themselves in positions of post commander across the country. More and more of our guys, already in the VFW or American Legion, are becoming the leaders of the local chapter. Kind of like Ron Paul has kind of taken over central committees in a lot of the state political parties, same kind of thing. That brings in nullification. When you have people that loyal to the Constitution first and start thinking very seriously about what it's going to take to stop the violations of the Constitution, and they set aside party loyalty, they will think beyond just voting for the next candidate. What do we do now to stop it? What do we do when the national government is dominated by oath breakers? And the answer is nullification. And Jefferson and Madison showed us the way back in 1798 with the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. What do you do when the federal government is dominated by a corrupt oath-breaking party? The states have an obligation to interpose. That was their answer. They didn't go hand in hand to the Supreme Court or the federal court begging them to defend the Constitution. First of all, they didn't have time to do that. People were being arrested right then and there at the time for just publishing things against the president, for criticizing the president. Second of all, they knew the federal courts were dominated by Federalists at the time. The party that was in power in the White House also dominated the federal courts. And so Jefferson and Madison realized that it's up to the states anyway, and as a practical matter, that's where it's going to have to be. And they did. They both advocated nullification and interposition by the states. That was the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. They both spell out for you. First, Jefferson said in the Kentucky resolution, he gave a very short and very well-written summary of what our form of government is, explaining what it is. That it's a compact between the states, created a new government with certain limited powers for certain limited ends, right? And he said, because this new government, this federal government, is a creature of the states, if it steps outside the bounds, whose responsibility is it to rein it in? It's the states. And so there's like a dual sphere of sovereignty. The states have all of the sovereignty, and the people, all the sovereignty and all the powers not delegated to the federal government. And under our Constitution, the two are supposed to counterbalance each other. It's not just separation among the three branches. Legislative, you hear that all the time. Separation and balancing of power between the three branches, right? The executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch will counterbalance each other. And that's true, but another critical counterbalance is the states versus the national government. If the states step across the line, the national government is supposed to be there to be a counterweight and stop their abuse. And the other way is also true. If the national government steps out of line, it's incumbent upon the states. Most people nowadays have been kind of poisoned and their understanding warped to the point where they think that it's only a one-way street. When the states get out of line and violate the Constitution, they haven't got a problem at all with federal judges declaring it unconstitutional, or even sending federal troops, like sending troops into Little Rock to enforce desegregation of the schools. They're fine with the federal government stopping the states from violating the Bill of Rights or violating the Constitution, but they are not fine with the states doing that. And so it's kind of bizarre. It's like, well, how could it be that in a flawed institution, made up of flawed human beings who are prone to error, that you could have absolute faith in this flawed institution of human beings in the federal government to always do what's right and to stop abuse by these people over here, but not the other way. And that's what's become warped, is this idea that the supremacy clause means that anything passed by Congress is the supreme law of the land. That's one problem, which is not true. The only thing supreme law of the land is what's pursuant to the Constitution, right? So, but the other problem is, then they'll say, well, but if you're going to challenge it as unconstitutional, you got to go to the federal government, into the federal courts, and only they can say. And the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of what's constitutional. And they tell you that the Constitution says so. Where does it say that in the Constitution? It's not in there. They have a duty to, under their own oath, to declare something unconstitutional. Yeah, I think they do. But so does the governor. So does every state legislator. So does every veteran. So does every sheriff. So does every citizen. We all have those duties. It's bizarre. Look at the context of Nuremberg. In Nuremberg, the Nazis who were on trial there defended themselves by saying we're just following orders. We told them that's no excuse. You had a duty and obligation to say no. Of course, what does that presuppose? It presupposes an individual judgment that what you're being told to do is wrong. Even if your government said it's right, even if the German courts said it was right, everything the Nazis did was legal, quote unquote legal. Under German law, it was legal. Okay? Just as in Jefferson's time, Madison's time, if they litigated the Alien Sedition Acts, which were, these are gross violations of the First Amendment, arresting people for criticizing the president for their speech and throwing them in jail, criminalizing free speech, direct violation of the First Amendment. And yet it happened. There was a law passed by Congress, signed into law by President John Adams, one of the founding fathers. This is a good example of how power corrupts, and every man is, we're all fallen. Every man is susceptible to the temptations of power and human error. So, and of course, the federal courts at the time are dominated by the same party. Would they have gotten any kind of redress from the federal courts? They would not have. But later on in American history, now in that situation there, what happened is that the Jeffersonians, Madison joined with Jefferson, and they swept the Federalist Party out of power in the elections of 1800, called the Revolution of 1800. They were swept out of power because the American people who had just fought a revolution, just ratified the Constitution and state conventions, understood what their rights were. They could see this was a gross violation of the Constitution, and they rooted them out politically. It was a peaceful resolution through politics. So that is one possibility. If we had enough of an awakening in this country, or an understanding of the Constitution, it is possible we could do something like that. I think that window's closing. I gave a speech to the Republican Party in Clark County, Nevada in 2010 and told them, you have one more chance to fix things politically by rooting out oath breakers. If you don't, and you continue to put oath breakers into office, then you'll close the door on a peaceful solution. That's what I told them. And unfortunately, where do they wind up doing it?
No.
They re-elected another cycle of oath-breaking Republicans. Should not be a shock at all that you had Republicans voting for gun control. You know, what was that one thing called Toomey-Mockin compromise bill proposed? You just had a national candidate for president, Romney, nominated even after he had, as governor, had voted for gun control and signed into law the Massachusetts Solomons ban, which violated the Second Amendment. Pretty gross violation of the Bill of Rights. And so the politician in the Republican Party can look at that and go, wait a minute, you can go ahead and vote for gun control. It's not really a third rail. And you could even wind up having the nomination for president someday from the Republican Party. So, of course, you're going to get more oath-breaking Republicans. Anyway, the point being is I don't know if we have the ability to do a revolution 1800, modern counterpart. We might not be here. So we might have to just rely entirely on nullification in the states, resistance by each state. And what would that look like? Well, another good example is the resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act in the North. I encourage you to go read Thomas Wood's book on nullification. A really good book. He talks about that history. And you had a law, once again, a law passed by Congress, the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that anybody in the North or anywhere was under an obligation to turn over, report and turn in runaway slaves. Anybody who sheltered them could be thrown in jail. And you had the Supreme Court rubber stamp that in Dred Scott. It's okay. It's a constitutional law. No northern state could ever shelter a runaway slave. A runaway slave could never be a citizen of a northern state and be sheltered by their state constitution and their laws. Now, what was the reaction of the Northerners? Did they say, oh, sorry, I guess the Supreme Court's made their ruling, we have to obey it? Is that what they did? No, they nullified. They refused to comply. Juries refused to convict in the North. This is one of the important points to remember, because the jury is there as a check on government power. It's your final check. It's your final veto. And it's kind of bizarre. When people attack jury nullification, they'll say, oh, it's ridiculous, it leads to chaos. And you can't have people, letting people go who clearly violated the law. Well, every governor has the power of pardon, clemency and pardon, and so does the U.S. president. What's that for? It's there as a final check. So even when just laws are unjustly applied, they can go in and let the person out. So if the president can do it and the governor can do it, why can't you do it? Well, you can. That's why it's always been there. So the reaction and resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act is a really good example. Juries nullifying, refusing to convict, sheriffs refusing to arrest, and sheriffs interposing, threatening to arrest U.S. Marshals. So they didn't care what the Supreme Court said. They said, we don't care what the Supreme Court says. We still think it's unconstitutional. And if you come into our county to come arrest somebody who is aiding a runaway slave, we're going to throw you in jail, Mr. U.S. Marshal. So that's what they did. It's an important example of resistance to tyranny and unlawful action by the national government. And the founders had done much the same thing in resistance to the crown and the parliament. Much the same thing. You had towns, like in reaction to being told they couldn't have town meetings, they said, okay, we'll do it anyway. Or they had county meetings, which only made them organize even more effectively at the county level. That's what you had in Suffolk County Resolve, and others like it. They came together as counties now. So it only helped organize them. But they didn't accept it as the end of the argument. When they were told that warrantless searches were fine, when they were told they had to turn in their weapons, when they were told they couldn't congregate, couldn't self-govern, what they do? They said, we don't care what you say, we're going to do it anyway. So they fell back on natural rights concepts. In our Constitution, we have something they didn't have. We have states. And we have the clear mandate from the Constitution, the 10th Amendment, that the states have a duty and obligation to impose. And so as Thomas Wood says, nullification is the intermediate step. It's the modest resistance. Because if you go beyond that, what else is left after that? There's revolution. Okay? So use the states. Use your towns, use your counties, use your states. Use those entities to do their job. All these oath-sworn county commissioners should be doing nullification resolutions against gun control, against warrantless searches, against the NDAA, against anything that's being done by the national government that violates our rights. When Congress passes, as part of their statutes, the authorization for the flying of 30,000 drones over U.S. skies, what should be the reaction of your county? It should say this is a no drone zone. No drone will fly over this county. We will shoot them down. That's what that should be their reaction.
So tomorrow.
Or the same goes for NDAA. The president has the power to detain Americans in military detention, and Congress rubber stamps it and says it's okay. The reaction of the counties and the states should be, we disagree. It's null and void from inception. See the trees and clause. You can't do this. This is the same thing King George did. We won't let you do it in the county. And not only will we not assist it, but if you come in here to do it, we'll interpose. We consider it kidnapping, an assault, or attempted murder, depending upon how they do it, in this county, and we'll arrest you.
Amen.
That's to be the threat. Yeah.
The 10th Amendment Center has templates for those things. I work with them on NDAA.
Right, they do. And I have one I wrote too, which I think is actually better, but we wrote one with the Inter-Coalition, and their lawyer and I got together and wrote model resolutions for sheriffs and county commissioners.
Is that on your website?
You go to the intolerableacts.org website, and we have a link from ours to that. But in some of these, there's sometimes a disagreement of strategy. 10th Amendment Center first likes to have a bill that condemns it, but doesn't do anything about it.
Well, mine.
No action interposition.
Mine, I added in.
You guys put some teeth in?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. We like to be a little more hardcore. We think it's important to declare it not just as null and void, but also to commit to interpose. Because if you had a sheriff in your county who says, well, I'm not going to help them, they don't need your help. They'll just come in here with their special team of Blackwater guys, or whatever they call themselves now, XE or whatever it is, latest one. They come in with some special team of hired guys. They go in and nab you, or the FBI comes in. They come get you, take you off, and then they turn you over to DOD, take you off to Guantanamo. They don't need the sheriff to do that. But what they do need is for the sheriff to stand down and stay out of the way. And so that's why your sheriff needs to commit that he's going to step in and interpose. That makes it messy. And if you have a sheriff with a large posse, like say you had a posse like Arpaio has, so you had even just an able-bodied posse of 500 people in your county, that changes everything. They can't just do it with, like I said the other night, they can't just do it with a small select team. They got to bring in the U.S. Army. Now they got to worry about the U.S. Army going along with it. So that's kind of the point of nullification and interposition, is you're pitting one sovereign against another. And among your neighbors, the perception is it's got more authority if your sheriff is doing it, an elected representative of the people, is doing it under his oath. It's much stronger than if your local private militia commander decides to do it. It's much better for the sheriff to do it with a big posse behind it. But he does need the actual physical support of a posse. One sheriff and 5 deputies saying we're going to interpose is not the same as one sheriff, 5 deputies, and 500 veterans. Different ballgame. Entirely different ballgame. They're much less likely to try it. And that's what's so critically important about nullification and interposition, is when a state passes a nullification like Kansas, they pass a pretty decent nullification resolution against gun control. Holder's response was, well, we're going to do it anyway. And their response was, we don't care what you think, we still hold to the same view that this is wrong. Well, the next step should be for the governor of Kansas to raise a state defense force, and for all the sheriffs of Kansas to have posses on hand so they have teeth, and they can say, if you come into this state to go do this, we will arrest you under this state statute, this state statute, this state statute. Whether it's kidnapping, whether it's assault, whatever it is. You want to come arrest people unlawfully, you're no longer shielded by the law, you're a common criminal, we're going to arrest you like one. But you got to have something to back it up. If you have posses, you have a state defense force or a real honest-to-God state militia in place, now it ups the ante, they're much more likely to not even try it. What I worry about is that we're so weak politically, or so weak structurally as a people, that they don't fear coming in and using these things against us because they perceive us as being weak, like the British Crown and Parliament perceived the colonists. There was a misunderstanding and miscalculation that led to warfare because they looked at the colonists, and the British officers were convinced that no colonists would ever dare fire on the king's troops. They were convinced of it. They were spectacularly wrong. They got the crap shot out of them, right? But they had to be proven wrong in combat, and by then it was too late. They couldn't back off, and probably wouldn't let them. So what I worry about, and I wrote about this back in 2006 actually, long before 9/11 happened, and long before the idea was presented in the Bush administration, the president could use laws of war against Americans accused of being part of the enemy, Al-Qaeda. Long before that, 2 lawyers wrote an article back in 1996, I think it was, or 1995, right after the Oklahoma City bombing. And they published this law review article in the Oklahoma City Law Review, intentionally, where they advocated that Timothy McVeigh should be tried by military tribunal, and that the laws of war should be applied to him, and should be applied to the entire militia movement. They said these are military enemies under the laws of war, and the U.S. government has the authority to use military force, military detention, and military trial. Sound familiar? If that was in the context of the Oklahoma City bombing and the militia movement, what would have happened if Bill Clinton had listened to these 2 clowns and had actually tried McVeigh by tribunal? He wasn't even part of the militia movement, but that's not the point. What if Clinton would listen to them and started rounding up militiamen under the laws of war and throwing them in military brigs and putting them on trial in front of courts-martial? What would have happened? Well, the militia movement would have been proven correct in their fear that Clinton was destroying the Constitution, that had been presented with no choice but to fight. They had just been stripped of their right to jury trial, stripped of the Bill of Rights, and being declared to be the same as a foreign enemy in wartime. They'd have fought back. It would have led to a cycle of action and reaction. They go to grab a militia commander or militia members, take them off to a military brig. The next time they come for somebody, I'm not going to get a fair trial. I'm not going to get a trial for my jury and my peers. You're just going to disappear me into some gulag. I'm going to fight.
Yeah, that's right.
And they'd have fought. And when the U.S. government would they have admitted their mistake? Would the Clinton administration have been, well, they were justified resisting our arbitrary detention of them? No, of course not. They just said all these extremists fired on U.S. government personnel who were just trying to conduct a lawful arrest under the laws of war. It would have been, they would have dropped the hammer more and more reaction. We've been thrown into a revolution or a civil war. And that's where we are right now. Because everything those 2 lawyers advocated had not yet been put into modern precedent. What they had advocated, but Clinton didn't have ready to go, Obama now has ready to go. thanks to the Bush administration. So they have put in place all the things that these two lawyers advocated. They've updated the laws of war and these old precedents from World War II. They've applied them to the war on terror. They've got court decisions saying it's okay to hold U.S. citizens in military detention. And they've got a president who's already begun to kill Americans with drones. So now, all that remains is the temptation to use this stuff domestically. Or to come drop the hammer on you for gun control or whatever else. And the same miscalculation is very possible. That they will not think you're going to resist. They will think they can go ahead and do it and get away with it. Because, hey, they got all the precedents. The court said it's okay. The president's been doing it. Congress said it's okay. Now it's there. It's sitting on Obama's desk. That big red button to use emergency powers and the laws of war against you is sitting right there. What's to stop them from pushing it? Unless you change the calculation in their head that they're going to face not just one man and his family or one small group, you must change the calculation so that they see they'll face an entire community together, all united. That's the only way you're going to get them to perceive it as too high a price to pay. Otherwise, it's a matter of time before they use that power. And once they do that, there are plenty of veterans across this country, I know, I talk to them all the time, who have said that the very first time they come grab some veteran under the laws of war and haul him off to a military brig, as far as they're concerned, it's on right there. They're not going to wait for them to come for them. They're going to take Solzhenitsyn's advice even one step further and not wait for them to come to your door. They're going to go after the bad guys. And who do they perceive as the bad guy? The entire political class. And the military leadership who will follow those orders. So, my point being is that you need to use nullification now. It is not only the middle ground of resistance, it's the last peaceful check or the last peaceful, what's the right word? Well, it's the last peaceful tool for getting them to back off. It's the last peaceful
Option.
yeah, well, you know, it's hard. It's like mutually assured destruction. That doesn't work so well if the other side has all the nukes and they perceive you as having none, right? Well, they didn't perceive that there's going to be some kind of backlash, some kind of concrete resistance. So they are a deterrent. It's the last deterrent. So I was trying to find a word for it. You need to have a strong deterrent, not just a resolution piece of paper that says we judge this to be unlawful, but you need to have the structure in place so they know they can't get away with just hammering an individual family or small community. It's got to be like counties and states standing up and making them perceive this as being a really big deal.
Yeah.
They're going to have to basically go to war against you, all out. Because if they perceive you as being so weak they can come drop the hammer on one family or a small community, and they go do it, that will lead to that cycle. I believe it will. That's your risk, that's your danger. So nullification is the right solution to get them to back off. It's not so much that you're going to legally win. They'll never admit you're right, but structurally they'll see that as now they got the sheriff, they got all the people. You know, politically they're going to be they're seen in a weaker position if they're facing a state standing up as a state, and even militarily. And the two things are never separated. When the fighting starts, politics don't end. You still have, you know, public opinion, the opinion of your fellow Americans still matters, even in the middle of conflict. Look at the founders, right? An entire year went by in warfare before they actually separated, before they finally decided that they really just could not reconcile. Many Americans still wanted to reconcile with the crown and stay within the empire. It took a year of the Hessians burning and pillaging and raping, a year of the British Navy going up and down the coast and burning towns, which they did. That is what had to happen to drive the majority of the population of the Patriot side over to decide to separate. It took a year of fighting. So you're in the same situation. It might be that we have to fight, but even if you're convinced that's going to happen, what your fellow Americans think about it and what they're willing to do about it is going to change over time, even in the middle of conflict. So don't ever think that, well, once the fighting starts, all the politics is out the window. It's a continuation of politics by other means. and it still goes on. That's why it's critically important that we always maintain the moral high ground. One thing you cannot do, first of all, it's immoral to become a monster to fight monsters. Second of all, it's bad strategy.
Yeah.
If you're a resistance movement, the last thing you want to do is adopt the immoral tactics of your opponents. So the founders had the wisdom also to know when to fight and how to fight. And they let the British crown, they let them become the clear aggressors. Like I said the other night, Kenneth Parker and his men didn't march on Boston. They waited for Gage to come to them. They nullified. They resisted and were refuseniks in their local communities. They stored up arms against the orders of the king. They held town meetings against the orders of the king. They organized local militias against the clear mandate from General Gage. They forced him to come out there with troops to try to stop them from what they were doing, which was organizing and preparing for resistance. And when they compelled him to come attack them, things kicked off in a strong position for them. They won a moral victory and they won a military victory. That's the way to do it. And then they continued on with that. Let the other guy take the mask off and show what he really is. Mm-hmm. That's one of the great benefits, I think, of time going by. Yes, they are. It's like a sweet spot for revolution. If you wait too long, like Patrick Henry was saying, because there comes a point where you've gotten as strong as you're going to get, and if you let things go so much that you have to fight, there comes a point where you need to fight. If you go any further, you become weaker, and he was right. I don't think we're quite there yet. We are still waking up many Americans. Of course, even after the fighting would start, war would wake up. But I don't think we've quite reached that sweet spot where we have to do something. This is the best time to do it. That's why I think it's incredibly important for you to be raising your sheriff's posses, waking up all your veterans, getting organized as states, becoming as strong as you can. All of preparedness, all of that will help you become in a better position. But if you wait too long, and they have 30,000 drones in the skies, and they've got the NSA tapping every phone conversation, you have total information awareness, then you would be much weaker at that point, right? So there is a point where you've waited too long. We should try to stop things politically if we can, try to stop things peacefully. But if it comes to a point where we either have to do something, or we'll be under this total tyranny and like a Stasi dream of total surveillance, if you know that you've reached that sweet spot where you have to fight back, where you're going to become weaker, even then, you still need to make sure that you do so in a moral way and a smart way. Let them be the aggressor. That's why I think resistance at the local level and nullification is the right way to do it. Follow the founders' footsteps, follow their example of you resisting, you separating yourselves and becoming autonomous and running your own lives, and then force them to come for you. So if you get Washington State or Oregon or Montana or even District County to start nullifying, and go cut your timber again, go fishing. Even they tell you you can't go fishing or go hunting. They can't tell you you can't go hunting. Use your lands. But have the organized resistance so that they can't just come hammer one person and be ready to resist as a community. But force them to come after you. Then they show their full, they take the mask off and show what they really are. That puts you in a better position when dealing with your fellow Americans. So anyway, that's all I wanted to say about that. Time to go?
I've got a question for you.
It's 8:30. We should go for a couple more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to mention, you mentioned some things about some writings you've done, whether it's the sheriff's posse thing or like the no drone zone. Do you have initiative templates or anything like that? So do we believe in taking a proactive stand?
Yeah, on the 10th Amendment Center's got some against NDAA.
Who's that?
10th Amendment Center's got some.
Okay.
We have some that I've helped write. It's on the Intolerable Acts.org website.
Oh.
Right. And those are resolutions against the NDAA. We're writing some for gun control too.
Mm-hmm.
Also on Oath Keepers, we have a Milan LeVay pledge that we put out. That's just like a pledge not to disarm. That's a good one to print up to get to gun shows. The important point is to get people to commit to themselves and to each other that we're not going to comply. I'm not going to comply as an individual, and then we're not going to comply as a community. Then you go to your sheriff, you want him to commit.
Right.
Then you do it officially. Yeah.
We'd like our county to take a leadership role, leading by example from the state.
Well, one way to do it is to it's an educational tool also. You go put resolutions against gun control in every gun shop, a personal pledge, and you ask them to adopt that as individuals, and then that helps them understand, it's like a talking points list of why you can't turn in your semi-automatics, because they have the most military utility. They're an essential military function. Okay, so things like that are good. We'll be writing another one for sheriffs, more detailed one for sheriffs pretty soon. We'll put it on our website. Okay, any other questions at all? Nope. We're done. Okay, we're done.
Thank you very much.